The wheels of the stagecoach were a sound of torment. They did not roll. They sucked and pulled, fighting the earth for every inch. Outside the cracked leather flap, Montana was not a territory of promise. It was a sea of cold. Gray mud mixed with a sleet that was half rain, half ice, striking the canvas roof with the sound of thrown gravel. Inside, Clara Monroe sat rigid. Her hands knotted so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white stones. She was clutching a letter. The paper was softened with damp and worry. The ink blurred, but the words were burned into her mind. A husband, a safe home, a good man. The words were a prayer she had bought with her last dollar, a lie she had told to a stranger in an advertisement, and a lie he had, perhaps, told back. She was 22 years old and felt ancient. The cold seeped up from the floorboards, penetrating the thin soles of her boots and climbing her legs until it settled deep in her bones. She had been on this coach for 6 days, changing lines, sleeping upright, eating nothing but dry biscuits, and all the while, the image chased her. It came again, as it always did when the jolting stopped or the landscape grew too vast. The smell of smoke, thick and oily, not the clean scent of pine wood, but the stench of possessions burning, the high, thin wail of an infant, and the sight of the farmhouse, its frame a black skeleton against a pre-dawn sky. She had run. She had left the crying behind and run until her lungs tore and her feet bled. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the memory down. That was Kansas. That was another life, another name, another world. She had run from the fire and the wail and the man who had caused it all. Now she was running toward a man she had never seen, in a place she did not know, hoping one terror could erase the other. The coachman yelled something lost to the wind, and the heavy carriage lurched, throwing her against the wall. They were slowing. The mud was giving way to ruts, and through the sleet, she saw shapes, buildings, a town, or the mean suggestion of one, huddled against the vast, empty plain, Coldwater Station. The coach stopped. The silence that fell was heavy, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the endless whistle of the wind through the eaves of the general store. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver called, his voice rough. Clara took a breath that felt like breathing in dust and ice. She gathered her single, battered valise. The letter was in her pocket now, a cold weight against her thigh. She pushed open the door and stepped down into mud that rose over the tops of her boots, soaking her stockings in an instant. He was there. He was the only one there. He stood on the warped planks of the boardwalk, unmoving, watching her. The outline had promised a good man. The man before her was tall, yes, broad-shouldered beneath a coat so threadbare the wool was matted and thin. He wore no hat, and the wet sleet darkened his brown hair, plastering it to his skull. He was unshaven, a thick growth of beard covering his jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were gray, and they were not just tired, they were hollow, like looking down a dry well, empty from years of loss. This was Eli Ward. He did not move to help her with her bag. He did not smile. He just watched her wade through the mud, his gaze flat, assessing. "You are Clara Monroe," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come from the ground itself. "I am," she whispered, her voice stolen by the wind. She stopped a few feet from him, dripping, trembling, suddenly aware of her cheap dress and the mud that caked her hem. His eyes traveled over her, from her soaked hair to her face, lingering on her mouth, and then down to her ruined boots. Clara felt the assessment like a physical touch, cold and clinical. She saw a flicker of something in his expression, not kindness, but perhaps surprise. The outline said her beauty unsettled him. She did not feel beautiful. She felt like a drowned rat, bought and paid for. "The preacher is waiting," he said, turning away before she could answer. He picked up her valise as if it weighed nothing and started walking. Clara had no choice but to follow, hurrying to keep up with his long, impatient strides. His silence was unnerving. She was used to solitude, to the quiet of running. But this was different. This was a silence that judged. He was a man made of emptiness, and she was terrified she would fall right into it. The church was not a church. It was a small, unpainted clapboard building at the edge of the dying town, its steeple barely a suggestion. The wind howled around its corners. Inside, it was half frozen. There were no pews, just rough benches. A single stove in the corner gave off a miserable, smoky heat that did not touch the cold. A thin man in a dark coat, the preacher, was stamping his feet by the stove. He looked harried, his nose red. "You are late, Ward. The light is failing." "We are here now, Reverend Gideon," Eli said, his voice flat. He dropped Clara's bag by the door. There was one other person in the room, a man slumped on a bench near the back, his head lolling. He smelled of whiskey and wet wool. "The witness," Eli said, nodding toward the man, offering no other name. The preacher sighed. "Let us get this done." He opened a book, his fingers stiff with cold. "Stand here." Clara moved to stand beside Eli. He was a wall of cold wool and damp. She could feel the chill coming off him. Or perhaps it was her own. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. "Do you, Eli Ward, take this woman, Clara Monroe, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Eli's "I do" was quick, rough, like clearing his throat. "Do you, Clara Monroe?" The preacher's voice droned on. Clara looked at Eli. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the far wall, at a crack in the wood, as if he were memorizing it. "So long as you both shall live?" She could not speak. The silence stretched. The drunken witness snorted in his sleep. "Ma'am?" the preacher pressed, impatient. The image flashed again. The smoke, the wail. "I have to—" It was this, or it was the wilderness, and she would not survive the wilderness. "I do," she breathed. The words were a betrayal, but she did not know who she was betraying more. The infant she left, or the man she was tying herself to. "You have a ring, Ward?" Eli fumbled in his coat pocket and produced a simple, thin band of silver, clearly not new. It looked old, worn. He did not look at her as he reached for her hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm against her frozen skin. He pushed the ring onto her finger. It was too large. "It is done, then," the preacher said, slamming the book shut. "That will be $2. Eli dropped the coins onto the preacher's open palm, turned, and picked up her bag. "We go." There was no kiss. There were no congratulations. Just the scrape of boots on the wood floor and the renewed scream of the wind as Eli opened the door. Clara, now Clara Ward, followed her husband back out into the sleet. The ride to his cabin was made in a small, battered buckboard wagon pulled by a single, weary mule. Eli had thrown a thick, greasy canvas over their legs, but it did little to stop the penetrating cold. The sun was gone, lost behind a wall of bruised purple clouds. The world was sinking into a deep, freezing twilight. They did not speak. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding of the mule, and the wind that tore across the landscape. And what a landscape it was. As they left the meager cluster of buildings behind, the land opened up into something terrible and vast. The hills rolled away into the gloom, snow-blasted and bare, their ridges topped with a black timberline of pines that looked like broken teeth against the sky. The sky itself was enormous, a merciless, churning gray that pressed down on them. It was a land that did not want people. It felt sacred in its emptiness and merciless in its power. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter. This was not a safe home. This was an exile. She watched the man beside her. He held the reins with a loose, competent grip, his gaze fixed forward. He seemed born of this place, hard, silent, and unforgiving. She had run from a fire only to land in ice. After what felt like hours, he pulled the mule to a halt. "We are here." She looked into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. Then, she saw it, a shape against the ridge, darker than the sky. A lonely cabin, small and low to the ground, looking as if the wind were actively trying to push it over. There was no light in the window. A corral nearby was made of leaning posts and broken rails. A single horse stamped in the dark, its breath a plume of white steam. Eli grunted, climbing down. "Wait!" He disappeared inside. A moment later, a weak yellow light flickered in the window. He returned and, without a word, lifted his arms. Clara flinched, but he was only reaching for her. His hands clamped onto her waist, and he lifted her down from the buckboard as easily as he had her valise. He set her on the ground and turned away to unhitch the mule, leaving her standing alone in the dark. Clara walked to the cabin door, her new ring feeling heavy and cold on her finger. She stepped inside. The cabin was one room. The smell hit her first. Old wood smoke, bacon grease, dust, unwashed linen, and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. A fire was struggling to life in the stone hearth, casting weak, dancing shadows. In the dim light, she saw his life. A narrow bed covered with a stack of hides, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves held tins, sacks of flour, and a few chipped plates. But it was the other things that held her gaze. On the wall, above the hearth, hung a long cavalry saber in its scabbard. Beside it, a dented canteen. On a small shelf near the bed, 2 faded photographs in wooden frames. They were too dark to make out, and leaning against the wall, next to the chair he would surely take, was a rifle, always within reach. This was not a home. It was a guard post, a place a man waited for a war that had either never ended or was about to begin. Eli entered, stamping the mud and snow from his boots. The wind slammed the door shut behind him, and the sound was final. They were locked in. He moved about the room with a methodical economy, adding wood to the fire, lighting a second lamp. He did not look at her. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. Clara sat, her hands folded in her lap, the silver ring loose on her finger. Their first supper as man and wife was silent. Eli moved with a quiet efficiency. He sliced salt pork into a black iron skillet, where it sputtered and smoked. He hacked off pieces of a dense, dark bread. He made coffee, boiled black and bitter in a pot over the flames. He set a plate in front of her. Salt pork and bread. He took his own plate and sat opposite her. The quiet was deafening. The only sounds were the scrape of his knife on the tin plate, the hiss of the fire, and the constant, high shriek of the wind rattling the single window. His politeness was worse than cruelty. It was a wall she could not climb. He did not ask her about her journey. He did not ask her where she was from. He did not ask her anything. His suspicion was a palpable thing. A third person at the table. He watched her when he thought she was not looking, his hollow eyes missing nothing. He was weighing her. What trouble had he brought into his isolation? Clara's smiles were brittle things, cracking on her face. She tried to smile when he passed her the bread. A small, tight movement of her lips that felt like a grimace. Terror was a cold knot in her stomach. She forced herself to eat the salty, greasy meat, forcing herself to swallow past the lump in her throat. She was trapped. The man who had attacked her in Kansas had been loud, his violence clear. This man's silence was a blade, and she did not know which way it pointed. When the meal was finished, he gathered the plates and scraped them clean into a bucket. He did not ask her to help. He moved to the fire and poured hot water from a kettle into a tin basin on the floor. Clara's heart began to pound, a dull, heavy thud against her ribs. Now, this was it, the part of the bargain she had tried not to think about. He was her husband. He had paid for her. She watched him, frozen in her chair. But Eli did not turn to her. He did not speak. He set the basin near the fire and, with his back to her, began to unbutton his heavy wool shirt. Clara could not look away. She sat in the shadows of the room, watching him in the flickering orange light. He pulled the shirt off, and she saw his back. It was a map of old pain. The firelight caught the ridges of scars, white and silver against the skin of his shoulders and back. Some were thin, straight lines, others jagged. They were old wounds, long healed, but they spoke of a history she could not guess. The war, a fight, something brutal. He was lean, but the muscles in his back and arms were hard, corded from work. He bent over the basin, the water steaming. He washed his face, his neck, his arms, his chest. He moved with that same slow, methodical restraint. He seemed utterly unaware of her presence, or perhaps he was pointedly ignoring her. Clara's breath caught. Guilt and desire warred inside her. She felt the sharp, sudden pull of his quiet strength, the raw honesty of his scarred skin. He was damaged, just as she was. But the feeling was immediately smothered by shame. The memory of the fire, the baby's cry. She was a liar. She was ruined. She had no right to sit in this man's house, no right to feel anything but the terror of discovery. He finished washing, dried himself on a rough piece of sacking, and pulled a clean undershirt over his head. He turned, and Clara quickly dropped her gaze to her hands, her heart hammering. He looked at her, standing there in the middle of the room. She could feel his eyes on her. The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken expectation. "The bed is yours," he said, his voice flat. Clara looked up, confused. He pointed to the narrow bed with the hides. "It is the only one." He grabbed a heavy blanket and a rolled-up bedroll from under the bed. He tossed them onto the floor near the hearth, as far from the bed as the small cabin allowed. "I will sleep here," he said. He sat on the floor, his back to her, and began to pull off his boots. Clara did not know what to feel. Relief, so profound it made her weak, and a strange, sharp sting of rejection. He did not want her. He had paid for her, married her, and he did not want her. She stood slowly, her legs shaking. "Thank you." He did not reply. She took her valise and, with trembling hands, retrieved her thin nightgown. She turned her back to him, facing the cold wall, and quickly undressed, her skin prickling in the cold air. She pulled the nightgown over her head and slipped under the heavy, animal-smelling hides. They were surprisingly warm, but the bed was hard. Eli doused the main lamp, leaving only the dull red glow of the fire. The room sank into near blackness. Clara lay rigid, listening. She heard him settle into his bedroll. She heard the creak of the floorboards as he turned, trying to find comfort. The wind screamed, a lost soul trying to get in. She lay awake for hours, every nerve alive. She listened to the breathing of the strange, scarred man on her floor. She was a wife, but not a wife. She was safe, but not safe. Sometime, deep in the night, long after his breathing had evened out, he shifted. He mumbled something, his voice thick with sleep and shadow. It was not her name. It was a woman's name, Sarah. He whispered it once, a sound of such profound, lingering sorrow that it cut Clara to the bone. He turned again and was silent. Clara stared into the darkness, the stranger's ring loose on her finger, the stranger's ghost between them. She closed her eyes, and the only thing she saw was the smoke, and the only thing she heard was the wind, and the name Sarah echoing in the cold. The first days passed in a silence as cold and deep as the snow piling in the drifts outside. A new calendar began, marked not by dates, but by the rhythm of survival. Clara learned the land and the cabin, which were as unforgiving as the man who owned them. She learned to cook on the fickle wood stove, which had two temperatures, smoking cold or roaring hot. She learned to bank the fire at night and coax the embers back to life in the black, freezing dark of morning. She learned to haul water from the well, the bucket so heavy it bruised her palms and soaked her skirts, the water freezing to the wood by the time she reached the cabin door. She learned to chop wood. At first, she could barely lift the axe, her hands soft from a different life, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses. She cared for the single horse, named Soldier, brushing him down, clearing his stall, speaking to him in whispers. He was the only living thing that seemed to welcome her company. Eli worked with a methodical detachment. He was a creature of labor. He spent 2 days repairing the broken corral fence. His hammer blows a dull, rhythmic percussion against the vast quiet. He would leave before dawn, his rifle on his back, to check trap lines, returning after dusk with a few rabbits or a fox, which he would skin and clean with a speed that made Clara turn away. He moved like a ghost in his own home, eating what she cooked without comment, his gaze fixed on the table, or the fire, or some point in the middle distance she could not see. The isolation of the ridge was absolute. There was no one else, no travelers on the unseen trail below, no neighbors, no sound but the natural world, and the isolation amplified everything. The cabin itself seemed alive with noise. The timbers groaned under the weight of the wind. The floorboards creaked under their boots, announcing every small movement. The scrape of a tin plate, the hiss of the fire, the click of the door latch, each sound was sharp, loud, cutting through the thick silence they built between them. They lived in a world of small glances. She would watch his hands when he cleaned his rifle, marveling at their strength and precision. He would watch her when she stood at the window, staring out at the white, endless hills. Her shoulders slumped, her body rigid with a tension he could not name. They were 2 people in a box, circling each other, one bound by a past she could not speak, the other by a past he would not. The first crack in the ice came a week into their marriage. The cold had settled deep, and the wood was frozen solid. Clara was outside, splitting kindling near the door, her frustration making her careless. The small axe was heavy. Her hands, numb inside her worn gloves, slipped on the handle. The blade glanced off the log and struck the chopping block, but not before her left hand, which had been steadying the wood, slipped into its path. It was not a deep cut, but it was clean, and it was immediate. She didn't cry out. She simply stared, shocked, as the bright, impossible red of her blood welled up and spilled onto the snow-dusted wood. She felt him before she saw him. He had been in the shed, oiling tack. He moved without a sound. One moment she was alone, the next he was there. He did not speak. He took the axe from her numb fingers and dropped it. Then, he grasped her arm above the wrist, his grip firm, and pulled her toward the cabin. He sat her in the chair by the fire, hard. He moved to the stove, poured water from the kettle into the washing basin, and ripped a strip from a clean flour sack. He knelt before her. Clara watched, trembling, the pain a dull throb against the sharp cold. He took her hand in his. His own was rough, the skin cracked, his knuckles scarred, but his touch was not. He washed the cut with a gentleness that was terrifying. His movements were slow, deliberate, his calloused thumbs brushing the blood from her skin, his fingers supporting her palm. He worked in total silence, his head bent, his focus entirely on her hand. The pain was real, but it was his touch that shook her. It was the first kindness she had felt in so long. It felt almost like violence. It undid her. She looked down at the dark, wet hair on his bent head, the broad strength of his shoulders. She felt a sudden, dizzying urge to put her other hand on him, to feel the life in him. He finished cleaning the wound. It was not as bad as the blood had made it seem. He wrapped the white strip of cloth tightly around her palm, his fingers moving with practiced skill. He tied the knot, and for a second, too long, he did not let go. He held her bandaged hand in his his thumb resting on her pulse point. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, he dropped her hand and stood. He turned away from her, his back rigid. "Be more careful," he said, his voice a low rasp. He went to the stove and poured coffee. The moment was over. But the silence that returned was different. It was heavier. It was filled with the memory of his touch. That night, the wind howled, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from inside the cabin itself. They ate supper in the usual quiet, but Clara could feel him watching her. She could feel the new awareness between them. After the plates were cleared, Eli did not turn to his chores. He sat at the table, staring into the fire. He reached under his bedroll and pulled out a brown bottle, half full of amber liquid, whiskey. He set it on the table. He didn't retrieve the tin cups. He drank straight from the bottle, a long, slow swallow that made his throat work. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stared back into the flames. "The war," he said, his voice sudden and rough, making her jump. She waited. "You see the scars," he said. It was not a question. "They are not all from the war, but the worst ones are." He took another drink. "I had a brother, Samuel, younger than me, full of God and glory. He followed me to Tennessee. I told him to stay back. I told him to hold the line." Eli's voice was flat, a recitation of old facts. "He did not listen. He wanted to be a hero. He ran ahead, took a ball in the gut at Shiloh." Clara watched his profile, etched by the firelight. His hollow eyes seemed to be seeing it, right there in the flames. "It took him 2 days to die. He kept asking for water. He kept asking for Mother. I was there. I held his hand. I listened to him beg me to shoot him. I did not." He stopped. He set the bottle down, his hand wrapping around it. "I should have." Clara's heart ached. She did not know this man, but she knew that pain, the pain of the survivor. "After that," he continued, his voice even lower. "After Samuel, killing was easier. It was just a chore." He paused, and his next words seemed pulled from him. "I killed a man after, not a soldier, after the surrender. We were in Texas, my friend, another man from my company. He was not right in the head. After, he got in a poker game. A local man accused him of cheating. Pulled a gun. I was standing at the door. I shot the man before he could fire. He was just a thief, but I shot him in the back." He turned his head and looked at her, his gaze sharp, drilling into her. "I killed a man to save a friend, and I felt nothing at all. That is the man you married, Clara." He was testing her. He was showing her the darkest part of himself, to see if she would run. And she felt a sudden, desperate urge to match his honesty. The words rose in her throat, burning like the whiskey she had not tasted. "I left a child. I ran from a burning house. I left a man to die." She saw his eyes, waiting. He had shown her his truth. He was waiting for hers. She faltered. The fear was too strong. This man, who had just admitted to killing, who lived with guns and ghosts. What would he do to a woman who had abandoned her own infant? He would not just turn her out. He would despise her. He would look at her with a hatred she could not bear. She could not speak the truth, so she did the only other thing she could. She stood from her chair. He watched her, his expression wary. She crossed the small space between them and stood before him. He did not move. He just watched her, his eyes dark. She leaned down, her bandaged hand trembling, and pressed her mouth to his. It was a cold, clumsy kiss. Her lips were chapped, his rough with beard and whiskey. He was rigid, his body hard as oak. Surprised, she felt him inhale sharply. She felt the second he stopped resisting and the second he gave in. His hand came up, not gently, but not cruelly, and tangled in her hair, holding her head in place. His other arm circled her waist, and he pulled her down onto his lap, his mouth suddenly hungry, desperate. This was not the gentle man who had bandaged her hand. This was the man from Shiloh, The man from the Texas card game. The man starved of touch and warmth. The kiss was not tender. It was raw. It was a collision of two lonelinesses, a desperate, fumbling act of erasure. It was a way to stop talking, to stop thinking, to simply feel. He kissed her like a man drowning, and she held on, her fingers digging into his shoulders, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was tilting. His hands were rough on her, pulling at the buttons of her dress, his breath hot on her neck. He whispered something. Not a name, just a sound, a groan of need. He stood, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her the 2 steps to the bed and laid her down on the hides. He did not go back to his bedroll. The intimacy that followed was as hesitant and honest as the kiss. It was trembling, awkward, and quiet. There were no words, only the sound of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and their breathing. It was the first flicker of warmth between 2 souls who had been freezing for a very long time. It was a fragile, desperate comfort sought in the dark, a way to hold the ghosts at bay, if only for an hour. When Clara woke, the sky was a pale, bruised gray through the window. The cabin was cold. The fire was down to embers. Eli was gone. She heard the ring of the axe outside. He was already at work. She lay in the bed, in the warmth they had made, and the guilt crushed her. It flooded in, cold and heavy, drowning the small, fragile warmth of the night. She had used him. She had taken his confession and answered it with a lie of the flesh. She had sealed her deceit. She threw off the heavy hides, her bare feet hitting the freezing floor. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking. She felt dirty. She went to her valise, tucked under the bed. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. She dug beneath her few clothes and pulled out the only thing she truly owned, a small, oval locket, tarnished silver. She opened it. Inside was not a photograph, but a small, faded sketch on parchment, a drawing of a baby's face, asleep, round cheeks, a tuft of hair, her daughter. She sank onto the chair, tears blurring the image, the memory of the fire, the wail, her own running feet. She had chosen herself. She had chosen survival over her own child. The door opened, letting in a blast of frigid air. Eli stood there, his arms full of firewood. He stopped when he saw her. He saw her posture, the locket in her hand, the tears streaming down her face. He dropped the wood into the box by the hearth with a clatter. He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, watching her. His face was unreadable in the dim light. "Who is that?" he asked. His voice was not unkind, just quiet. Clara's heart hammered. Tell him now." But the lie was there, formed and ready. It was the lie she had practiced, the lie that kept her safe. "My sisters," she whispered, her voice thick. "My sister's child. They both died. The fever." She closed the locket with a snap, the sound echoing the closing of a door in her heart. She put it away. Eli watched her, his gray eyes searching her face. He seemed to want to say something. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded. Once. Sharp. He accepted the lie. Or perhaps he simply did not care enough to question it. "The wind is rising," he said, turning back to the fire. "I need to ride to town for supplies before it hits. We are low on flour and shot." The new silence that fell was worse than the old. The old silence had been empty. This one was full of her lie, full of the intimacy they had shared and the truth she had withheld. He worked, she cooked, and the space between them was a mile wide. Later that morning, he saddled Soldier. He looked different. He was shaven. The beard was gone, revealing a strong, square jaw and a mouth that looked harder, less hidden. It also revealed a long, thin scar that ran from the corner of his eye to his jawline, a white line she had not seen before. He looked younger, and somehow more dangerous. He mounted the horse. "I will be back before dark," he said, and rode out, not looking back. Clara watched him go until he was just a black speck against the snow. She spent the day in a haze of guilt, scrubbing the floor, mending his shirts, trying to work the shame out of her body. Eli rode into Coldwater Station. The town was battened down, the wind already sharp, carrying the taste of ice. He tied Soldier outside the general store and went in. The store was warm, smelling of coffee, tobacco, and dried apples. A few men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, drinking coffee. The proprietor, Mr. Hames, nodded at Eli. "Ward, nasty day for a ride. What do you need?" "Flour, coffee, lard, and a box of shells." As Hames gathered the goods, Eli stood near the stove, soaking in the warmth. The men were talking. "And I told him, that is no weather to move cattle," one was saying. "Speaking of new arrivals," another man said, spitting tobacco into a can. "Heard you got yours, Ward." Eli did not respond, just looked at the man, his eyes flat. The man, a teamster, laughed nervously. "Saw you at the church last week. Got that mail-order bride? Pretty thing. Where's she from?" "Kansas," Eli said, his voice clipped. The men glanced at each other. The first man, the one who had been talking about cattle, leaned forward. "Kansas, you say? That is interesting. We was just hearing talk. A Pinkerton man was through here 2 days ago, asking after a woman from Kansas." Eli's body went still. "Aye," the store owner said, setting a heavy sack of flour on the counter. He had a poster, looking for a woman named something Monroe, from down near Dodge City. Eli's blood turned to ice. Clara Monroe. "What for?" Eli asked, his voice steady. "Murder," the teamster said, his voice dropping. "Says she murdered a wealthy rancher. Her boss stabbed him and then set his farmhouse on fire to cover it. Fled with his money." The poster said armed. The first man added, "And dangerous." Eli stared at the men. He saw the speculation in their eyes, the new, greedy interest. They were looking at him, then glancing toward the door, as if expecting her to be there. He paid Hames for the supplies, his movement stiff. He packed the sacks onto Soldier, his mind racing. A sketch of a child. Her sisters. Died of fever. Liar. Set his farmhouse on fire. The smell of smoke. The crying infant she had mentioned in her letters. The one she said she was running from. He rode out of town, pushing Soldier hard into the rising wind. The sleet was starting, stinging his newly shaven face. Murder. He had married a killer. He had brought a killer into his home. He had touched her. He had shared his brother's ghost with her. And she had lied. When he reached the cabin, the storm was closing in. The sky was black, the snow driving horizontally. He burst through the door, the wind trying to tear it from his grasp. Clara was standing by the fire, a stew simmering. She looked up, a small, hopeful smile on her face, the first he had ever seen. It died when she saw his expression. He said nothing. He unloaded the supplies, his movements violent, dropping the sack of flour on the floor. The air in the cabin was electric, colder than the storm outside. His stare was not just hollow. It was cold. It was the look he must have given the man in Texas before he pulled the trigger. "Eli," she whispered, "what is wrong?" He turned to her, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "Who are you, Clara?" Before she could answer, the wind hit the cabin with a force that made the buildings shudder. The storm had trapped them. The night had fallen. And there was no escape. Not from the snow, and not from the truth. Later, the blizzard raged. A white, screaming wall against the window. They were prisoners. The tension was a living thing, a predator in the small room. He had not spoken again. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the oiled rag moving back and forth, back and forth. Clara sat on her chair, her hands knotted, her heart a cold stone. Finally, he was done. He stood. He began to prepare for bed, on his roll on the floor. The wall between them was absolute. He turned his back to her, and, in the dim, flickering light of the fire, he pulled his shirt off over his head. She watched him. She saw the map of his past, the silvered scars on his back, the hard lines of his shoulders. She saw this man who had shared his pain, who had killed, who had been gentle with her hand, and who now looked at her as if she were poison. The firelight reflected off the surface of her eyes. His scars, his honest, visible scars, swam in the reflection of her own silent tears. She was crying for his pain, for her lies, and for the man in Kansas she had been accused of killing. She was crying because she knew, in the suffocating closeness of the storm, that the questioning had only just begun. The storm did not pass. It settled. The wind that had been a sharp whistle rose to a high, steady shriek, a sound that seemed to come from the throat of the sky itself. By the second morning, the window was a white, opaque square, plastered over with snow. By the third day, the drifts were piled against the door, and Eli had to use his shoulder to force it open, carving a narrow trench just to get to the woodshed in the stable. They were snowed in. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. For weeks, they lived in that small, pressurized box. Time ceased to be measured by sunrises, for there were none. There was only the gray, howling light of the storm, which faded into a black, howling darkness. Time was measured by the diminishing pile of firewood, the scraping sound of the scoop at the bottom of the flour sack, the last of the coffee beans. The tempers frayed first. The silence, which had been hostile, now became suffocating. Every sound was an intrusion, the way Eli's spoon scraped his tin plate, the way Clara sniffled, her body fighting the constant, seeping cold. He would chop wood with a contained violence, the thud of the axe against the logs he brought inside filling the room. She would scrub the floorboards, her knuckles raw, scrubbing at spots that were not there. Eli watched her. He had slept on the floor by the door every night since his return from town, his bedroll a clear line drawn between them. He slept with his rifle beside him, not pointing at her, but near, always near. His quiet fury was a thing she could feel, like a drop in temperature. He was a man coiled, waiting. The end of the second week, the last of the coffee was gone. Eli boiled chicory root, a bitter, black drink that tasted like burnt earth. He set a cup on the table for her. She did not touch it. He sat opposite her, the fire casting long, jumping shadows. "You will drink it," he said. It was not a request. "I am not thirsty. You will eat, and you will drink. I will not have you dying on me." "Why?" she snapped, the word sharp in the dead air. "It would solve your problem. The men in town would not have to hang a dead woman." His eyes, which had been dull, flashed with a cold, gray light. He leaned forward. "So you admit it." "I admit nothing." "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low, more frightening than any shout. "The men in town say you are Clara Monroe. They say you are a murderer. They say a Pinkerton man is asking, that he has a poster, that he is looking for the woman who fled Kansas after burning a ranch down." Clara stood, the chair scraping loud against the floor. "They are liars." "Are they?" He stood with her, a tall shadow cutting off the firelight. "You lied to me. You lied about the locket. You lied about your sister. You wept over a dead child that was never yours. What else are you lying about?" She backed away, hitting the cold cabin wall. "I did not lie." "Stop," he commanded. "Stop this. I shared. I told you things. About Samuel, about my life. I showed you the man I am. And you let me touch you, knowing you were wanted for murder." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisoned. She broke the weeks of silence, of fear, of cold, of his accusing eyes. It all shattered. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ugly sound. "He was an old man," she wept, sliding down the wall until she was huddled on the floor. "My employer, he was cruel. He would not let me leave. He came to my room. He was not right." Eli watched her, his face granite, unmoving. "I fought him," she choked out. "I tried to run. He would not let me go. He fell. He hit his head on the fire grate. I ran." She looked up, her face a mask of tears and terror. "He died the night I escaped. He died. I did not mean to, but he died, and I ran." She had finally confessed. She had killed him. Eli stared at her for a long, terrible moment. He saw the poster he had not seen. He saw the Pinkerton agent. He saw the gallows. He saw the lies she had brought into his cabin. He had wanted peace, and he had married a hanging. His rage was sharp, and it was cold. It was the rage of betrayal. He felt used, tricked. He looked at his hands, the ones that had touched her, and he felt dirty. He turned away from her, his back a rigid wall. "Get in the bed," he said, his voice dead. She did not move, just wept on the floor. "Get in the bed," he repeated. "I will not look at you." He took his bedroll, shook it out, and laid it on the floor, as far from the bed as he could get, by the drafty, howling door. He lay down, facing the wood, his rifle laid out on the floor beside his hand. Clara, shivering, crawled into the cold bed and pulled the hides over her head, her sobs muffled by the heavy fur. The storm shrieked. The man by the door did not move. Days passed. The silence that fell was not empty. It was a grave. They moved around each other like ghosts in the cramped space. He would leave to check on Soldier, to clear the snow, and the moments he was gone were the only moments she could breathe. He ate standing, his back to her. She ate when he was not looking. The food dwindled. They were down to salted pork, hardtack, and beans. The hunger made the silence sharper, the anger more brittle. Clara's mind began to fray. She was trapped in a box with a man who believed she was a killer, a man who hated her, a man she had, for one night, felt something for. The shame of that night was worse than the cold. She would look at the door, at the white, screaming void outside, and she began to see it not as a prison wall, but as an escape, a clean, cold escape. On the 10th day, or perhaps the 15th, she had lost count, the wind stopped. It did not fade, it simply ceased. The sudden, profound silence was shocking, deafening. Eli noticed it first. He stood from the table. He went to the door and cracked it. The gray light was brighter. A lull. He pulled on his coat. "Stay inside," he said, his first words to her in a week. "I am checking the roof. The weight." He climbed out. Clara watched him from the window, scraping the ice away with her fingernail. He disappeared onto the roof, the scraping of his shovel a dull sound overhead. This was it. She did not think. She acted. It was the same instinct that had made her run from the fire in Kansas. She did not take her valise. She did not take food. She grabbed her thin wool coat, the one she had arrived in, and her boots. She slipped out the door, into the trench Eli had dug. The air was frigid, still, and it burned her lungs. She began to walk, pushing her way out of the trench and into the deep, untouched drifts. The snow was up to her waist. Every step was a battle. She did not look back. She walked toward the timberline, toward the white, silent hills. She did not know where she was going. She was just leaving. She heard him shout her name. "Clara!" The sound was sharp, angry. It made her move faster. She stumbled, fell into a drift. The snow cold and soft as a bed. She pushed herself up, gasping. She heard the sound of his heavy steps, plunging through the snow behind her. He was faster, stronger. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around. What are you doing? Are you insane?" "Let me go!" she screamed, fighting him, her hands beating uselessly against his thick coat. "Let me go! I would rather die out here than in there with you." "You will." He snared, his face red with cold and fury. "You will not last 10 minutes." He did not argue. He threw her over his shoulder. She was so light from the lack of food. He barely felt the weight. He carried her, kicking and sobbing, back to the cabin. He kicked the door open and half threw her onto the floor inside. He slammed the door, the bar dropping into place. She lay on the floor, a soaked, freezing heap, broken. He stood over her, breathing hard, snow melting from his hair and beard. He looked down at her, and the anger, the cold rage he had been nursing for weeks, suddenly broke. She was not a murderer. She was not a liar. She was a child, a half-starved, terrified, stupid child who had just tried to kill herself in his snow. Duty overtook anger, the part of him that was a soldier, the part that had held his dying brother. It took over. "Get up," he said, but his voice had changed. It was rough, but the deadness was gone. He pulled her to her feet, his hands rough. Her coat was soaked. Her dress beneath it was wet, clinging to her. She was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. "Get those clothes off, now!" She was too cold, her fingers too numb, to obey. He did it for her, his movements brusque, impersonal. He unbuttoned her dress, pulling the wet wool away from her skin. He stripped her down to her thin undergarments and wrapped her, hard, in the heavy, dry hides from the bed. He sat her in the chair by the fire and pushed it so close the heat stung her skin. He stoked the fire until it roared. He found the last of the whiskey and poured a splash into a tin cup, filling the rest with hot water. He knelt before her and pushed the cup into her trembling hands. "Drink it." She drank. The liquid burned a path down her throat, settling as a small, dull warmth in her stomach. He was chafing her feet, his rough hands rubbing, forcing the life back into them. He rubbed her hands, her arms, his motions quick, efficient, and desperate. "Damn you," he whispered, his head bent over her hands. "Damn you for a fool." He looked up, his gray eyes burning into hers. "Do not die on me. You will not die on me." The command, the raw terror in his voice, broke the last wall inside her. He had saved her. He had dragged her back from the clean, cold death she wanted, and he was warming her with his own anger. "I did not kill him," she whispered. The words came out, cracked and hoarse. Eli stopped rubbing her hands. He stared at her. "You said he died." I lied," she sobbed. "Not the way you think. I lied before. When I said he died, I do not know." He waited, his face a mask of confusion. "He attacked me," she said, the words spilling out now. "Unstoppable. My employer, Mr. Blevins, he was a wicked man. He came to my room. He was drunk. He tore my dress." Her voice broke. "I had a knife, a small one, for mending thread. I told him to stop. He laughed. He grabbed me. I stabbed him in the side. I did not mean to kill, just to stop him." She was looking through Eli, back to that night in Kansas. He fell. There was blood. So much blood. He was screaming. I panicked. I dropped the knife. I grabbed my shawl. And I ran. I ran out the door, into the night. I fled before sunrise. I never looked back. I do not know if he lived. I do not know if he died. I ran. I left him bleeding on the floor." The cabin was silent save for the roar of the fire and her ragged breathing. Eli sat back on his heels. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the truth. This was not a murderer. This was not a cold-blooded killer. This was a terrified woman who had defended herself and run. But the relief he wanted to feel did not come. Instead, something else settled in. His trust was fractured. but in a new way. He believed this story. It felt real, more real than her first confession, but it did not change the facts. "A Pinkerton," he said, his voice flat. "A bounty poster. Whether you killed him or just left him bleeding. Clara, they are hunting you. You ran. You look guilty. You brought damnation to my door." He stood. He was not angry. He was just tired, defeated. He had saved her life, but he could not save her from the truth. He could not save himself from it. He wanted to believe her. He did. But he could not shake the thought that she was a lighted fuse, and that he was the man holding her when she finally blew. The storm, as if exhausted by its own rage, settled into a deep stillness. The wind died. The snow stopped. The world outside was muffled, gray, and dead quiet. Inside, the silence was just as heavy. Eli did not move his bedroll back to the door. He did not move back to the fire. He sat in the other chair, watching the flames, his rifle across his lap. Clara sat wrapped in the hides, her clothes steaming as they dried by the hearth. They existed in that silence for hours. The confession hung between them, unresolved. As the light in the cabin began to fail, a new tension rose, the high emotion of the rescue, the raw confession. It had stripped them bare. There were no more lies, no more polite distances. There was only the truth, the cold, and the two of them, trapped. The suppressed desire that had flickered between them weeks ago, the thing they had both ignored and feared, returned. It returned like a fever. It was not love. It was not even affection. It was a desperate animal need not to be alone. It was the clinging of two people who had touched death. She in the snow, he in his memories, and were terrified of the quiet that came after. He looked at her. Her hair was damp, loose around her pale face. Her eyes were huge, dark with exhaustion and fear. She looked at him. His face was hard, his jaw set, but she saw the tremor in his hand as it rested on the rifle. He was as lost as she was. Neither moved for a long time. Then she stood, the heavy hides falling away. She was in her thin undergarments, shivering, but not from cold. She did not go to the bed. She went to him. She knelt on the floor in front of his chair. He did not move. He just watched her, his breathing shallow. She put her shaking hand on his knee, on the rough denim. "Eli." He closed his eyes. A shudder went through him. He set the rifle on the floor, the sound of the metal on the wood loud in the stillness. He reached for her. They clung to each other, a desperate tangle of limbs by the fire. It was not the hesitant intimacy of before. This was raw, fueled by fear. They clung to each other as if the storm were still raging, as if the silence itself were a thing that could tear them apart. It was a hopeless act, a way to forget who they were, where they were, and what was coming for them. Afterward, the stillness returned, heavier, colder. The fever had broken, leaving only the chill. Clara lay on his bedroll by the fire, her body aching. She turned her head. Eli was sitting up, his back to her, staring into the dying embers. She saw the shame in the hard set of his shoulders. He had taken comfort from a woman who was hunted, a woman he could not trust, a woman who had brought ruin to his door. He was ashamed of his weakness, of his need. He must have felt her gaze. He turned his head slightly. He saw the tears tracking silently down her face, glistening in the firelight. She was not crying from pain or fear. She was crying because she knew the act had solved nothing. It was just another secret, another layer of shame, in a cabin full of them. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, the world was blindingly bright. The storm had cleared. Sunlight, sharp and white, poured through the window, illuminating every speck of dust in the cabin. Eli rose first, his movement stiff. He pulled on his boots and coat, his face a hard mask. He had to check on Soldier to see the damage. He unbarred the door. The fresh, frigid air was a shock, stinging their lungs. The light reflecting off the perfect, untouched snow was painful. He stepped outside. Squinting, he stood on the small path he had cleared, looking out over a world reborn in white. He froze. Clara, wrapping a blanket around her, came to stand in the doorway behind him. "What is it? Is it Soldier?" "No," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The horse is fine." He pointed. She followed his finger. At the edge of the timberline, maybe 60 yards from the cabin, in a place sheltered from the worst of the wind. The snow was not pristine. There were tracks, a man's boots, and the clear, precise, oval impressions of snowshoes. Nearby was a small, frozen pile of horse droppings, and the disturbed snow where a horse had been tied to a tree. Someone had been there. They had been there for a long time, watching the cabin. They had been close enough to see the smoke from the chimney. They had been waiting for the storm to break. Eli looked at the tracks. Then he looked at her. His face was like carved stone. "They know you are here." The tracks were sharp in the new snow, insulting in their clarity. Eli stood, his breath a cloud of white, his eyes following the trail. Not just one man, two. They had been careful, keeping to the timberline, using the storm for cover. They had snowshoes. They were professionals. He turned and went back inside, his face hard. The hope from the night before, the fragile warmth, all of it frozen and gone. Clara was by the hearth, stoking the fire. She looked up, the question in her eyes. "We have company," he said, his voice flat. "Or we did. They were watching the cabin during the storm." Her face went pale. "They?" "2 men, on snowshoes, waiting." He checked the load in his rifle. His movements economical, precise. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason. Keep this." He handed her his spare revolver, the one he kept tucked in his bedroll. She stared at the weapon, her hands shaking. "Where are you going?" "To town, to see what I bought in that church." He did not wait for an answer. He pulled on his heavy coat, took his rifle, and left. She heard him in the shed, saddling Soldier. Then, the sound of the horse plunging through the deep snow, fading, until there was only the vast, bright silence of the morning. Clara barred the door. She sat in the chair, the heavy revolver in her lap, her hands clasped on top of it. She waited. The ride to Coldwater Station was long, the world a blinding white. The snow was deep, slowing Soldier to a laborious walk. Eli's mind was a separate storm. He replayed her confession, the rancher, Blevins, the fight, the knife, leaving him bleeding. He believed her. He had seen the terror in her eyes, a terror that could not be faked. It was the terror of a victim, not a killer. But the tracks outside his cabin were not the tracks of men who cared about the truth. They were the tracks of men who cared about a poster. Coldwater Station was digging itself out. Men were shoveling paths, their breath pluming. The town looked tired, beaten by the storm. Eli tied Soldier to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office. Inside, it was warm, smelling of stale coffee and tobacco smoke. Sheriff Josiah Taggart was at his desk, his feet up, reading a week-old newspaper. He was an older man, his face a map of wind and worry. "Ward." Taggart nodded, not moving his feet. "Heard you got snowed in. You look it. What brings you out?" "Strangers," Eli said, getting straight to it. He leaned against the doorframe, not coming fully into the room. "Found tracks near my ridge. 2 men, on snowshoes, watched my cabin during the storm." Taggart's feet hit the floor. "The hell you say? Watched it? Or just passing through?" "Watched it. They were dug in." Taggart stroked his gray beard. "That is troubling. That matches." Eli's stomach tightened. "Matches what?" "A man came through here, just before the storm hit. A Pinkerton agent. Name of Cutler. Asked me if I had seen any new arrivals. Specifically, a woman. Eli's body went cold. He kept his face impassive. A woman? Aye. Taggart stood and walked over to a stack of papers on a shelf. He pulled one from the bottom. He left this, figured it was a waste of paper in this weather. Now, I am not so sure. He handed the paper to Eli. It was a bounty poster. The ink was rough, the sketch hasty. But it was her. The name read Clara Monroe. The description was close enough. Wanted for the assault and robbery of Anselm Blevins. And for arson, near Dodge City, Kansas. He said Blevins died, Taggart said, watching Eli's face. Stabbed him, took his money, and set the farmhouse on fire. There is a $500 reward. Enough to make a man freeze his toes off, I suppose. Eli stared at the paper. Arson. She had never mentioned a fire. Robbery. She had never mentioned money. He felt the cold truth of her confession fracture again. She had lied. She had lied about the fire, just as she had lied about the locket. This Pinkerton, Eli said, his voice quiet. Did he say where he was going? He was heading west, toward the mountains, to check the mining camps. But he said he would be back. He said he had a feeling about this town. Taggart took the poster back from Eli's numb hand. Ward, that new wife of yours, where did you say she was from? Illinois, Eli lied, his voice flat. And she is my wife, Josiah. Taggart held his gaze. The unspoken warning hung in the air. The sheriff was a lawman, but he was also a neighbor. Well, Taggart said, sitting back down. You tell me if you see those tracks again. I do not like bounty men sniffing around my county. They cause more trouble than they solve. Eli nodded, turned, and walked out into the blinding sunlight. The ride back was a torment. He was a man split in two. He saw the poster, arson, robbery. This was not the story she had told him. This was not a terrified woman defending herself. This was a cold, calculating criminal. He had brought a liar into his home, into his bed. And yet, he saw her face in the snow. Do not die on me. He saw her, wrapped in hides, confessing. I left him bleeding. His mind flashed back to Texas. After the war, he had worn a badge for 2 years. A deputy marshal. He had done it because, after the chaos of Shiloh and the lawlessness of the surrender, he had craved order. He had craved a simple line between right and wrong. He had hunted men for less. The lawman's blood in him. The part that believed in rules and consequences. Screamed that this woman was trouble. That she was a lie. That he should ride back to Taggart, hand him the poster, and wash his hands of her. But his instinct to protect her, the raw, animal part of him that had dragged her from the snow, that had held her by the fire, it roared just as loud. He had saved her life. He could not be the one to end it. He arrived at the cabin as the sun was touching the western ridge, painting the endless snow in shades of cold pink and blue. He did not speak when he entered. He did not have to. Clara saw his face, the fragile connection they had forged, the shared fear and desperation. It was gone. In its place was a terrible, cold distance. He was not angry. He was not sad. He was assessing. He looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved, a column of figures to be added up. She knew. He had seen the poster. He had heard the stories, and he believed them. He would hand her over. It was the only logical thing to. This was his land, his life. She was a stranger, a liar, a $500 bounty. She was damnation. He spent the next hour outside, checking the perimeter of the cabin again, moving with his rifle in his hand. He was not a husband. He was a guard. Clara moved with a quiet, terrible purpose. She went to her valise. She took out her only other pair of stockings, her thin gloves. She went to the pantry. She wrapped 2 strips of dried salt pork and a handful of hardtack in a cloth. Her hands were shaking, but she did not stop. She was not running from him. She realized she was running for him. She had brought this to his door. She would be the one to take it away. She would not let those men, the men on snowshoes, find her here. She would not be the cause of his ruin. Night fell. The cabin was a tomb. He sat at the table, his back to her. He was cleaning his rifle. The familiar, meticulous shk-shk of the oiled rag sliding through the barrel was the only sound. Clara lay in the bed, the heavy revolver he had given her tucked under the pillow. She pretended to sleep. She watched his broad back, a dark silhouette against the dim, dying glow of the fire. He stopped cleaning. He sat unmoving for a long time, his head bowed. The silence was absolute. Then he spoke. His voice was so low, so rough, she almost thought it was the wind, but the wind was still. "God," he whispered, or whoever is listening. His voice was thick, broken. "I do not know what is right. I do not know. She is a liar, but she is, I cannot." He put his head in his hands. "I cannot be the man who does that. I cannot, but the law, the poster." He took a ragged breath. She's just a child, same as, he choked on the word, a small, violent sound. "I am lost. Give me guidance. Forgive me for what I have done, for all of it." He was quiet for a moment, then a final whisper. "And keep her, wherever she goes. Keep her safe. Please, do not let them find her." Amen. Clara lay in the darkness, and her heart, which she thought was a frozen, dead thing, broke. He was not planning to betray her. He was as trapped as she was. He was praying for her safety. She knew then, with absolute certainty, what she had to do. She could not stay. She could not let him be caught between the law and her. She could not be the sin he had to carry. She waited. An hour, 2. She listened until his breathing evened out. The false, shallow sleep of an exhausted and tormented man. Before the first hint of gray light, when the darkness was at its deepest and coldest, she slipped from the bed. She moved like a ghost. She pulled on her boots, her coat. She took her small bundle of food. She tucked the locket, her one true possession, into the palm of her glove. She looked at him one last time, a dark, huddled shape by the cold hearth. She wanted to touch him. She wanted to wake him and tell him, what? The truth? The last, final, ugliest truth? She could not. She turned, eased the bar from the door, and slipped out into the frigid, blue-black air. She closed the door so gently it made no sound. She walked. The snow crunched under her boots. She did not look back. She walked toward the old, snow-covered trail that led east, toward the mountains, toward anywhere that was not here. Eli woke with a start. The cabin was wrong. It was the cold, a draft. He looked at the door. It was not barred. He looked at the bed. It was empty. The hides were thrown back. "Clara?" A blind, cold panic seized him. Not anger, fear. The same sickening fear he'd felt when she walked into the blizzard. She had done it again. "Clara!" He threw on his coat and boots, his fingers fumbling. He grabbed his rifle and burst out the door. The sky was a pale, sick gray. The air was sharp as glass. He saw them, footprints, small, hesitant, already filling with a light, blowing snow. They led east, toward the old trail. "Damn you," he breathed. "Damn you." He did not wait to saddle Soldier. The horse would be too slow in the deep drifts. He started to run, his long legs plunging, his mind empty of everything but her. He was not a lawman. He was not a husband. He was just a man. Desperate, following the tracks of the only thing he had. He followed her for hours. The sun rose, a merciless white light on the snow. He saw where she had stumbled. He saw where she had fallen to her knees and pushed herself back up. She was moving slower now, her steps dragging. She was freezing. She was dying. He found her near a frozen creek, a black, ugly cut in the white landscape. She had made it miles, further than he could have believed. She was just a small, dark bundle, collapsed in a drift, unmoving. No, the word was a prayer. He fell to his knees beside her, his lungs burning. He rolled her over. Her face was a waxy blue-white. Her lips were cracked. Her hair was stiff with frost. "Clara, Clara, damn you! Wake up!" He brushed the snow from her face, his rough hands shaking. He pressed his fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint, thready. "Clara!" He shook her, a desperate, rough movement. Her eyelids fluttered, crusted with ice. She woke from a deep, cold, peaceful place. She saw his face above her, a blur of panic and pain. "Eli," she breathed, the word a tiny cloud. Let me go." "Not this time," he said, his voice a raw growl. He pulled her up, lifting her into his arms. She weighed nothing. He began the walk back, his body screaming in protest. The journey home was a waking nightmare. The wind had picked up, driving needles of ice into his face. His legs were logs, his lungs on fire. Clara was a dead weight, unconscious again, her head lolling on his shoulder. He stumbled. He fell to one knee, the snow swallowing him to the hip. He did not let her go. "Hold on!" he gasped, pushing himself up. "Just hold on. Do not leave me. Do not you dare leave me here alone." He did not know if he was talking to her, or to himself, or to the ghost of his brother. He just kept walking. They collapsed together at the cabin door. He kicked it open and they fell inside, a tangle of half-frozen limbs, onto the cold floor. They were both half dead. He lay there for a full minute, gasping, the cabin spinning around him. He pushed himself up. Clara was shivering, a deep, rattling shudder that shook her whole body. He crawled to the hearth, threw kindling on the embers, and blew them to life. He dragged her closer to the new, weak flame. "Eli?" she whispered. Her eyes were open, wide and dark in her white face. "Hush! We are home. I will get the fire." "No." Her frozen glove, the locket still clutched inside, grabbed the front of his coat. You will hate me." Her voice was a dry crackle. "You will hate me when you know." "I know," he said, his voice ragged from the cold. "I saw the poster. I do not care." "No." The tears started, freezing on her cheeks. You do not. The fire, the poster. It was a lie. Blevins. He lived. The rancher. He did not die." Eli froze, crouched over her. "What?" I heard before I left Kansas. He lived. I wounded him, but he lived. The fire. It was just the lamp. It fell when we fought. It was not. I did not. It is not the truth." "Then what is?" he whispered, his heart pounding. "What is the secret? Clara, what is worse than that?" "The locket." She choked on the word, her chest heaving. "The locket, the baby. It is mine." The confession hung in the frozen air, absolute and final. "She is my daughter." Clara wept, the sobs tearing out of her. I had her before, with a man. It does not matter. I left her. I abandoned her at a church orphanage. I ran." She was looking at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand, or to hate her. "I ran. I wrote to you. I answered the advertisement because I thought no man would take me, not with a child. I was ruined. I thought I could start over. I left my own baby. Eli, I left her behind, just to save myself. That is who I am. That is who you married." She finished, Her confession a stone dropped into a deep well. She waited for him to stand, to walk away, to throw her back out into the snow. Eli did not move. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. The firelight caught the tracks of melting snow on his face. Then, new, hot tears mixed with them. They dripped from his jaw onto her forehead. He did not speak. He bowed his head, his forehead resting on her shoulder. His whole body shuddered. A single, violent tremor. "We are a pair, then," he whispered, his voice so thick she could barely understand him. "What?" He lifted his head. His eyes were raw, red, destroyed. "The war. I told you about Samuel. I told you it made killing easy." He swallowed, his gaze fixed on her. "I did not tell you. At Appomattox, it was over. We were just waiting. We were on patrol. And there was a boy." His voice broke. He stopped, took a ragged breath. He could not have been more than 13, maybe 14. He was in a gray uniform, all torn, too big for him. He had a rifle. He was just standing by a tree, crying. He was just a child. Eli closed his eyes. "He saw us. He raised the rifle. He was just scared. I did not think. I was not a man. I was just a thing. A soldier. I shot him. I shot a child. Clara, a child soldier. He just fell. He did not even make a sound." He was weeping now, the open, ugly sobs of a man who had been holding this in for 16 years. "I see his face," he whispered, his hands coming up to frame her face. Every night since you left your child to survive, to try and live." His tears dried on her face. I killed one." He looked into her eyes, and she saw all of his broken pieces. "Which of us is worse? Clara?" he asked, his voice a raw wound. Which of us deserves forgiveness?" There were no more masks. There was no more law. There was no poster. There was only this shared, brutal damnation. He pulled her close, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. They clung to each other on the cabin floor, half frozen, starving, and hunted. But for the first time, in the cold, dim light, they were not alone. The spring thaw came late and with a vengeance. The world that had been silent and white turned to a roaring, brown chaos. The snow on the ridges melted into torrents, and the creeks swelled into rivers. The ground was a sucking mire of mud that pulled at a man's boots and smelled of decay and new, cold life. In the cabin, the brutal honesty they had shared became a new, fragile kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of shared damage. They were two people with no masks left, and the sight of each other's true, ruined face was a thing that took getting used to. Eli slept in the bed now, his back to her, but the space between them was filled with the ghosts they had confessed. A boy in a gray uniform, a baby in an orphanage. The thaw meant the roads were open. It meant the men on snowshoes could ride. Clara's trial by rumor began. Eli rode to town for flour, his rifle across his saddle. The town was alive with mud and commerce. He saw them, two men, not from the territory, standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon. They wore new denim, city hats, and carried their revolvers tied low. They were not miners or ranchers. They were hunters. Sheriff Taggart found Eli by the general store. "Ward," he said, his voice low, not looking at him directly. "Those men, they are asking about you." "About me?" "About the woman you married, the Pinkerton. Cutler. He was back. He has been talking. The story is, it is worse now. They are saying Blevins died. They are saying it is a murder charge, for sure." Eli's face was stone. "Blevins is not dead." Taggart spat into the mud. "Does not matter what the truth is, Eli. It only matters what the poster says. And the poster says $500, dead or alive. These men, they do not care about the truth. They want the money. You cannot keep her up on that ridge. They will find her. Eli bought his flour and rode home. The landscape, which had been his refuge, now felt like a trap. He found Clara scrubbing the floor, a nervous energy in her movements. She looked up when he entered, and she knew. She saw the new tension in his shoulders. "They are in town," he said. She dropped the rag into the bucket. I will pack. I can go north. They will not." "No." He sat at the table, his hands flat on the wood. "You cannot run from this. Not anymore." "What do you mean?" "They are saying you are a murderer. Taggart said the poster claims Blevins is dead." "But he is not," she cried, standing. "I told you. He lived. I heard it." "I believe you," Eli said, his voice quiet. "But they do not, and they will not stop. Cutler, Blevins, this is not about justice. This is about revenge. Blevins is rich. He put a price on your head. Running will not save you. They will hunt you until you are in the ground." "Then what?" she whispered, her hands nodding. Will you give me to them?" He looked at her, and his gray eyes were clear for the first time in months. "No, I will not. We are going to Kansas." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "Kansas? That is where they want me. That is madness." "It is the only way," he said, standing. "We cannot prove you are innocent here. We cannot prove it in the mountains. We can only prove it in Kansas. We go find this man, Anselm Blevins. We make him tell the law you did not kill him. We make him call off his dogs." "He will not," she whispered, shaking her head. "He is a monster. He will see me hang." "He will not," Eli said, his voice hard. "He will not, because I will be with you. This ends. One way or another, it ends. We will not spend our lives looking over our shoulders." He went to the small shelf and picked up her locket, which she kept there now. In the open, he held it, the tarnished silver small in his rough palm. "And while we are there," he said, his voice softening, "we will look for her." Clara's breath hitched. Hope, sudden and sharp, cut through her fear. Her daughter, the child she had confessed and mourned, to go back, not just to face a demon, but to find an angel. "Eli, pack what you can carry," he said, turning away. "The decision made. We sell nothing, we just go. We will take Soldier and the mule. We leave tonight." The journey was a new kind of hell. They left the ridge under a sliver of moon, moving south and east, away from the main trails. The land was a sea of cold, sucking mud. The rivers were swollen and fast, and they crossed them in the dark, the icy water pulling at their legs, the animals snorting in terror. They traveled hard, moving before dawn. Stopping after dusk, they were hunted. Every rider on the horizon was a threat. Every plume of smoke from a distant chimney was a risk. Fear was their shadow, a constant companion that soured their food and chilled their sleep. Hunger was close behind. They ate cold biscuits and salt pork. Eli shot a rabbit once, and they cooked it over a small, nearly smokeless fire of dry willow. The taste of fresh meat so rich it made Clara weep. But the nights, huddled together under a single oilcloth and 2 blankets, were different. The fear and the hardship stripped away the last of their defenses. Their shared suffering became a new, fragile language. He would rub her frozen feet until the feeling returned. She would mend the tear in his coat, her fingers careful with the needle. He taught her how to read the tracks of deer, how to tell which way the wind would turn. She told him stories of her childhood, before her parents died, of an apple orchard in Ohio. They spoke of the child. "What is her name?" he asked one night, his voice a low rumble in the darkness, his arms around her for warmth. "Anna," she whispered, her voice thick. "Her name is Anna." "Anna," he repeated. He said it as if it were a prayer. "We will find her." They held each other, two broken souls clinging to a single, fragile hope in the vast, merciless wilderness. After 3 weeks, the landscape changed, the mountains fell away, and the great rolling plains of Kansas opened up. To Eli, it was just land. To Clara, it was a memory. Every hill, every creek bed was a place she had run from. The dread returned, a cold knot in her stomach. They were low on supplies. The mule was limping, and Eli's face was drawn with exhaustion. "We have to stop," he said, pointing to a small homestead, a sod house dug into the side of a hill, a plume of clean smoke rising from its chimney. "We need flour and salt, and we need to rest the mule." As they got closer, Clara's heart stopped. She knew this place. "Eli, no." "We must, Clara. We are spent." A woman came out, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, her face lined with sun and work, but her eyes were sharp. She held a shotgun loosely in her arms. "Keep riding," the woman called. "We have nothing for strangers." "Ma'am," Eli said, stopping Soldier, his hands in the air, away from his rifle. "My wife and I, we just need supplies. We have coin." Clara pushed back the hood of her coat. The woman squinted. Her eyes went wide. "My God," the woman breathed, lowering the shotgun. "Clara Monroe, is that you?" "Mrs. Albright," Clara whispered. She had worked here for a few months, after leaving Anna, before she had gone to work for Blevins. "Child, we heard you were dead, or in jail. We heard Blevins." "This is my husband, Eli Ward," Clara said quickly, sliding from the mule. We are on our way to Dodge." "Mrs." Albright looked at Eli, at his hard face and the rifle, and then back at Clara. "You come inside, both of you. You look half-starved." Inside, the sod house was warm and clean. "Mrs." Albright gave them stew and hot, strong coffee. She did not ask questions. She saw the desperation in their eyes. While Eli was outside, checking the mule's hoof, Clara sat by the small fire, the warmth a strange, forgotten luxury. "Mrs. Albright," Clara began, her hands shaking. When I first came here, I told you about my daughter, Anna." "Of course I remember. Child, I was the one who told you about the church." We are going to find her. Do you know the name of the place?" I cannot remember. St. Mark's Children's Home." "Mrs." Albright said, her face clouding. "In Wichita, but Clara." "What?" Clara's hope faltered. There was talk a year or so ago, a fire, a terrible fire." Clara's blood ran cold. The image that had haunted her, the burned farmhouse, the crying infant, it twisted, sharpened, became something new and more terrible. "No," she breathed. "I do not know for certain," the woman said gently. "It was just talk. But you go carefully, child. Wichita is a hard city now." Hope and dread, they rode in her chest, two fighting snakes. They reached Wichita 2 days later. It was not a town. It was a city, loud with the railroad, cattle money, and 1,000 new hard faces, saloons and merchants and hotels, all built fast and loud. They found the address for St. Mark's. It was in a poor section of town, near the river. It was gone. It was a pile of blackened timber and melted glass. A single soot-stained stone chimney stood, a monument to the ruin. Mrs. Albright was right. A fire. Clara made a sound, a high, thin wail that came from the bottom of her soul. She fell from the mule, her legs giving out. "No, no, no, Anna!" She crawled toward the ruin, as if she could dig through the charcoal and find her. Eli was off his horse in an instant. He grabbed her, hauling her back, holding her tight against his chest as she fought and sobbed. "Clara, stop! Stop it! She is gone," she wept, her voice muffled against his coat. "It is my fault. I left her, and she burned. Oh God, Eli, she burned." "You do not know that," he said, his voice fierce, shaking her. "You do not know. This was a fire, not a grave. We will ask." He held her, right there in the muddy street, until the terrible sobs quieted. He helped her up, his face grim. "We ask." They found a man nearby, repairing a wagon wheel. "The orphanage?" the man said, not stopping his work. "That burned down 2, maybe 3 years ago. Terrible night, middle of winter." "The children?" Eli asked, his hand tight on Clara's arm. "Most got out. The Reverend. He got most of them out. Some did not." Clara swayed. "Where is he?" Eli demanded. "The Reverend." "He is a traveling preacher now. Lost his church, but he is in town. Got a revival tent set up by the stockyards. Preacher Davies. You cannot miss it." They found the tent, a huge, dirty canvas structure. Inside, a man with a wild white beard was shouting about sin and damnation to a small, scattered crowd. They waited. When the sermon was over, Eli approached the preacher. "Reverend Davies?" The preacher turned. He had old, tired, but kind eyes. "Yes, my son." "My wife," Eli said, pulling Clara forward. "She is looking for a child, a girl, from St. Mark's. Her name was Anna." The preacher's face softened. "Anna, yes, I remember Anna. A small, quiet girl, dark hair. She was a solemn child." "Is she—" Clara could not say the word. "She is safe, my child," the preacher said, and Clara fell against Eli. "She is safe. I pulled her from the smoke myself. She was one of the last ones." "Where is she?" Clara gasped, hope so fierce it was a pain. "She was adopted. A good couple, God-fearing folk. They had lost a child of their own. They were passing through, heading north. A farmer." "A name?" Eli pressed. "What was their name?" The preacher thought, his brow furrowed. "It was a common name, Peterson. Yes, Arthur Peterson and his wife. Kind people. They loved that girl the moment they saw her. They said they had family up in Nebraska. Or maybe the Dakotas. They were heading north. North. It was a whole, vast territory. But it was a direction. It was a name." "Thank you," Eli said, pressing his last few coins into the preacher's hand. They walked out of the tent, the sun low in the sky, painting the stockyards red. Clara was crying, but they were not tears of grief. "We have a name," she whispered, looking up at him. "Peterson." "We have a name," he agreed. A small, thin smile touched his lips. "They needed to rest. They needed a plan. They were out of money. We will sell the mule," Eli said. "It will be enough for supplies. We can ride north on Soldier." They found a cheap boarding house near the yards, a place that smelled of livestock and boiled cabbage. They took a room. They would sell the mule in the morning. But the bounty hunters had not been idle. Cutler was not just a Pinkerton. He was a good one. He had traced her to Wichita, to the story of the orphanage. He had been asking questions, too. They were in the dark alley behind the boarding house, heading for the small stable to check on the animals one last time. The air was cold, smelling of the nearby slaughterhouses. "That is far enough. Ward." The voice came from the darkness at the end of the alley. "Two shapes." Eli reacted instantly. He shoved Clara, hard, toward the stable door. "Run! Clara! Get inside! Bar it!" A muzzle flash lit the alley, the sound a deafening crack. Eli grunted, firing his own rifle from his hip toward the flash. A man screamed, fell. But the second man, Cutler, was smarter. He was off to the side. He fired. Eli cried out. A sharp, choked sound. He staggered, falling against the wall, his rifle clattering to the mud. "Clara, run!" But she had not run. She had Eli's revolver, the one he had given her back at the cabin. She raised it with both hands, her body shaking, and fired toward the second flash. She heard a curse. "Damn you!" Cutler yelled. Another shot whined past her head, striking the wood. Then the sound of running boots. Retreating. He was gone. Silence. The alley was black, smelling of gunpowder. "Eli?" "Here." His voice was a weak rasp. She found him, slumped at the base of the wall. "Eli, where? Where did he hit you?" My side." She felt the wetness. It was warm, sticky. So much of it. It was Blevins, all over again. "We have to move," she said, her voice shaking, but cold with a new, hard purpose. "The stable, now." "Leave me. Clara, go. Find Anna. Go north." "Be quiet," she commanded. She was no longer the terrified girl. She was the woman who had crossed a blizzard. She hooked her arms under his, pulling. He was a dead weight. "Help me, Eli, help me!" He groaned, pushing with his legs. She dragged him, step by agonizing step, into the black, odorous safety of the barn. She kicked the door shut and dropped the bar. She fumbled in her pocket, her hands slick. She struck a match, a single, weak flame. She found a lantern and lit it. She held it up. He was pale, his eyes closed. The left side of his coat was a black, sodden mass. She ripped it open. The wound was low, in his gut, ragged and dark. "Oh, God," she breathed. "It is bad," he whispered, his eyes opening, his face beaded with sweat. "No," she said, ripping a long strip from her petticoat. "It is not." She pressed the cloth, hard, into the wound. He cried out, a choked, terrible sound. "Hold on," she whispered, her own tears starting. She found horse blankets, piled them on him. He was shivering, his body going into shock. She sat, her hands pressed over his, applying pressure to the wound, trying to will the bleeding to stop. You should have run," he murmured, his voice fading. "I will not run," she whispered, the tears streaming down her face, dripping onto his. "Not from you, not ever." She bent her head close to his, the lantern light casting huge, dancing shadows. "You will hate me when you know. Eli, I did not tell you everything. The poster, the arson, the robbery. I did not do it, but I know Blevins. He will not stop. He will lie. He will see me hang. He will find us. I brought this to you. I am the reason you are." She could not finish. She was confessing her own damnation, her own fear that she was the poison that killed everything she touched. "I cannot lose you. I cannot." He was quiet for a long time. She thought he was gone. Then his hand, bloody and weak, came up, touching her tear-streaked cheek. He managed a weak, ghastly laugh, a sound that turned into a cough, bringing up a fleck of blood. "Clara." He looked at her, his eyes surprisingly clear in the dim light. "Too late," he whispered. "Too late for hate." His hand fell, his eyes closed. She sat with him, her hands pressed to his side. The world narrowed to the small, guttering flame of the lantern and the faint, shallow breath of the man she loved. As the first cold, gray light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the barnwood, she saw that he was still breathing. He was pale as death, but he was alive. She leaned down, her body aching, her hands numb and sticky. She kissed him, her chapped lips pressing against his cold, damp forehead. It was a kiss of desperation, of grief, and of a love so powerful it felt like its own terrible wound. She realized in the cold, dim light, that this was their last absolution. This love, born in lies and silence, forged in blizzards and confessions, and now sealed in blood, was the only true thing they had left. It was the only grace they would ever be given. He survived, but only just. Eli Ward was a man made of old scars and hard muscle, but the bullet in his gut had torn through him, seeking to unravel the very life he had just begun to reclaim. The nights in the Wichita barn were a fever dream, a descent into a private hell. Clara became his anchor in that hell. She sold the mule for $30, a pitiful sum, but it was enough. She spent it not on food, but on a bottle of whiskey, carbolic acid, and a roll of clean bandages from a hurried, suspicious pharmacist. She became a surgeon, a nurse, a thief. While Eli lay shivering and whispering the names of dead men, Samuel, and the boy he shot, she cleaned the wound. She boiled water in the stable's tin bucket. She cut away the ruined flesh with Eli's skinning knife, which she had sterilized in the lantern's flame, her stomach heaving, her hands steady. She poured the whiskey into the raw, open wound, and Eli's silent scream was more terrible than any sound she had ever heard. She packed it, stitched it closed with her mending needle and thread, and prayed to a God she no longer trusted. For 2 days, she did not sleep. She sat by his side, pressing damp, cold rags to his burning forehead. When his fever spiked, he thrashed, his eyes open but unseeing. He spoke of Shiloh, of the mud and the blood, and he cried out for his mother. Clara held him, whispering, "I am here, I am here. Eli, hold on." She knew Cutler, the Pinkerton man, would be back. They could not stay. On the 3rd night, Eli's fever broke. His breathing, which had been a shallow rasp, deepened. He woke, his eyes clear but exhausted. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw her, pale, stained with his blood, her hair matted. "Clara," he breathed. "I am here," she said, her voice cracking. You stayed." "I told you," she whispered. "I will not run, not from you." She had used the rest of the money to buy a broken-down farm wagon and a single, sway-backed horse. It was theft, what she paid for it, but it was all they had. She half carried, half dragged him from the barn into the back of the wagon, hiding him under a pile of filthy canvas. They left Wichita under the cover of darkness, 2 fugitives with nothing but a name, Arthur Peterson, and a direction, north. The journey was a slow agony. Eli lay in the back, the wagon's jolting sending waves of pain through him. Clara drove, she hunted, she bartered, she sold her silver locket, the last true thing she owned, for a sack of flour and 2 tins of beans. When she did it, she felt a strange, cold peace. The sketch of Anna was gone, but the memory was seared into her heart. She no longer needed a token. Eli slowly healed. The plains of Nebraska were a vast, empty sea, and under that enormous sky, he learned to walk again. He would lean on her, his arm draped over her shoulders, as they walked beside the wagon, sparing the horse. The wound in his side knit itself together, leaving a puckered, angry red scar. He was thinner, the bones of his face sharper, but the hollowness in his eyes was gone. When he looked at her now, it was with a quiet, solid gratitude that was more binding than any vow. They found work where they could. He mended a fence for a farmer in exchange for a side of bacon. She cooked for a threshing crew for 2 weeks, earning enough coin to buy a new coat for him and boots for herself. At every stop, they asked, Arthur Peterson, a farmer, adopted a girl from Wichita, dark hair, named Anna. The name was a ghost. People nodded. Maybe they had heard it. Maybe they were heading to the Dakotas, for the wheat. Maybe they had gone west, toward the mountains, toward the gold fields. The trail led them west, into the Wyoming territory. The plains gave way to rolling foothills, and then to the sharp, blue peaks of the mountains. They were in a new land, a hard land of timber and rock, They reached a small town, hardly more than a single muddy street, tucked into a high valley. It was called Redemption Creek. A sawmill whined at one end of town, and 3 saloons stood opposite a general store. They were out of money, out of food, and out of hope. Eli, leaning on the wagon, his face gray with weariness, sent Clara into the store. "Ask," he said, "one last time." She went in. The store smelled of pine dust, coffee, and cured leather. A man was behind the counter. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low. We are looking for a family, name of Peterson, Arthur Peterson." The man stopped weighing beans. "Peterson? Aye, got a small ranch up the North Fork of the valley. Good people, quiet, keep to themselves mostly." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She could not breathe. You know them?" "Aye, he comes in for supplies. Got a wife and a daughter. Sweet girl. Quiet. Name of Anna." Clara leaned against the counter, the world tilting. After all these miles, after all this time. She walked out of the store, her legs numb. Eli saw her face. He straightened up, his hand gripping the side of the wagon. "Clara? He is here," she whispered. "Eli, he is here." He watched her, and he knew. This was her valley now. He had just been the man to get her here. They rested the horse. Clara washed her face in the creek, brushed her hair until it was smooth, and mended the tear in her skirt. She was terrified. What if they turned her away? What if she hated her? Eli drove the wagon. He would take her, but he would not interfere. "I will wait," he said. The ranch was small, but clean. A log cabin, smoke curling from the chimney. Fences were in good repair. A few cows grazed on the spring grass. It was a peaceful, solid place. A woman was outside, hanging white sheets on a line. A girl, tall for her age, was scattering feed for a flock of chickens. She had dark hair, pulled back in a simple braid. She was thin, but her face was full. She was healthy. Clara got down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the soft mud. She could not feel her legs. She walked toward the fence. The girl looked up. She saw a stranger, a pale woman in a worn dress, watching her. She was wary. She stopped throwing the feed. "Mama," the girl called, her voice clear and strong. The woman, Mrs. Peterson, turned. She saw Clara and her hand went to her apron, her expression tightening. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Mrs. Peterson asked, walking toward the fence. Clara could not speak. She just looked at the girl. Anna. Her Anna. She was beautiful. She was alive. She was safe. Clara's voice was a dry croak. My name is Clara Ward. I knew Reverend Davies from Wichita." At the name, Mrs. Peterson's face changed. She understood. "Arthur," she called to the cabin. "Arthur, come out here." A man came out, tall, blond, his face weathered. He stood beside his wife. They were a wall. "What is this?" he asked, his voice kind but firm. "I am Anna's mother," Clara whispered. The words fell into the quiet valley air. The girl, Anna, froze, the bucket of feed slipping from her hand. "Anna, go inside," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice sharp. "But Mama, go inside now." The girl looked at Clara, her eyes wide with confusion and a sudden, childish fear, and then ran into the cabin. Clara felt as if she had been struck. "Please," she said, her hands gripping the fence rail. I do not want to. I did not come to take her. I swear, I had to see her. I had to know she was alive. I saw the orphanage, the fire." She was weeping now, her shoulders shaking. "I thought she was dead." The Petersons looked at each other. They saw the agony in her face. They saw the wagon on the road, the scarred, hard man sitting on it, watching. "You should come in," Arthur Peterson said, his voice gentle. They sat at their small, clean table. Clara told them everything. Not about Blevins, not about the running. She told them about being young and poor and alone, about the shame, about leaving her baby because she thought she had no choice. She told them about the years of guilt and the search. We know," Mrs. Peterson said, her hands twisting in her apron. "Reverend Davies told us. He said you were a good girl in a hard place. Anna, she had nightmares, for a long time, of smoke." "I know," Clara sobbed. She is our daughter, Mrs. Ward," Arthur said. "We are the only parents she knows. She loves us. We are her life." "I know," Clara said, wiping her face. I would never ruin that. To see her, to know she is happy. It is all I ever wanted." This was the mercy she had not expected. They were not angry. They were not cruel. They were just parents, protecting their child. "She is a good girl," Mrs. Peterson said. "She helps her father. She is shy, but she is strong." "May I?" Clara asked. "May I just speak to her? Not as her mother, just as a visitor." They allowed it. They brought Anna out. She stood by her father, her hand in his. "Anna," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice soft. "This is Mrs. Ward. She is an old friend of the family. She wanted to say hello." Anna looked at Clara. She was wary, this strange woman who had made her mother cry. "Hello, Anna," Clara said, her voice trembling. Your mother, she says you are a great help with the chickens." Anna nodded, shy. "Yes, ma'am." That is wonderful. You have a beautiful home." "Thank you, ma'am." It was quiet, bittersweet. The reunion was not a mother embracing her child. It was two strangers, standing 6 feet apart in a clean kitchen. Clara saw her daughter, alive and whole, and knew, with a final, crushing certainty, that she had lost her forever, but she was alive. That was the grace. We must be going," Clara said, standing, her legs weak. Thank you for your kindness." They let her go. As she walked to the door, Anna spoke. "Ma'am?" Clara turned. Your necklace is gone," Anna said, pointing to Clara's throat. Clara's hand went to the empty place where the locket had been. How did you know?" Anna just stared, her face blank. I do not know. I dreamed it." Clara fled. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her face a mask of grief. Eli did not ask. He just clucked to the horse, and they drove away. He had watched from afar. He had seen her walk out, her shoulders bowed. He understood. She belonged to more than his arms. She belonged to that small cabin, to that lost child, to a grief he could never fully heal. And he loved her for it, and in spite of it. They did not leave the valley. Clara could not. They found an old, abandoned claim on the far side of the mountain, miles from the Peterson ranch. But still in the same world, the cabin was a ruin. The roof caved in, the logs rotten. We can stay here," Eli said. "Here? It is good timber. There is a creek. We can build it." And so they did. They started over, with an axe and 2 sets of hands. Eli's strength returned, the hard work in the clean mountain air healing his body, as Clara's presence healed his soul. They salvaged logs. They quarried stone for a new hearth. They worked side by side, felling trees, hauling timber. It was a hard, brutal life, but it was peaceful. They built a home, Not a cabin of suspicion and ghosts, but a small, solid house. Clara was allowed to visit the Peterson ranch. Once a month, she would walk the miles, bringing a small gift, a pie she had made from wild berries, a pair of mittens she had knitted. Anna remained shy, polite, Mrs. Peterson was always kind. They were two mothers, circling the same child, finding a strange, silent respect for one another. Rumors still circled. In a town like Redemption Creek, everyone's past was a subject for gossip. They knew Eli was a scarred man who had come from nothing. They saw Clara, the quiet, sad-eyed woman. They whispered, heard she was from Kansas, heard she was in some kind of trouble. But no one dared confront them. The world had moved on. Blevins, Cutler, the bounty poster. They were phantoms from another life. Eli Ward, with his quiet, steady eyes and the rifle that was always clean and always ready, was a man who invited no questions. He and his wife were left alone. 2 years passed. The cabin was solid, a testament to their shared labor. They had a garden, a few chickens, and Soldier, who was fat on mountain grass. One night, a summer storm rolled down from the high peaks. Thunder, deep and low, shook the plains, and the rain came in driving sheets. It was a night like the one in Montana, when the world had changed. The cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. Eli had come in soaked from checking the livestock. He stood by the fire, his back to her, and began to unbutton his wet shirt. Clara sat at the table, mending a seam. She watched him. The firelight played over his back, over the old white scars from the war. He turned to wash, and she saw the new scar, the one she knew as well as her own hand, the thick, puckered mark on his side, low, near his heart. The price he had paid for her. She felt no fear. The terror was gone, burned away by the blizzard, by the fever in Wichita. She felt only a deep, aching sorrow for all the pain they had endured, for the boy he shot, for the girl she had lost, and she felt a love so profound it settled in her bones, a love that was as solid as the cabin they had built. She put down her sewing. She went to him. He stopped, the wet rag in his hand, and watched her approach. She reached out, her fingers, calloused now from work, and gently, so gently, touched the scar on his side. He did not flinch. He just watched her. "You never asked me," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the sound of the rain lashing the roof. "Asked you what, Clara?" "You never asked if I regret lying, all those times. In the beginning. About Anna, about everything." He set the rag down. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear in the firelight. He took her hand, the one that was tracing his scar, and held it. He pressed her palm flat against the mark, against the warmth of his skin. "I would rather a lie that saved us," he said, his voice rough, "than a truth that killed us." He had forgiven her, and in that, he had forgiven himself. The thunder cracked, a sharp, violent sound directly overhead. Lightning flashed, a blast of white light that flooded the cabin, erasing the shadows for a single, stark second. He pulled her to him. She buried her face in his chest, and his arms wrapped around her, holding her tight. They stood by the fire, two broken souls, scarred and weary, but surviving. They had seen the worst of each other, the lies, the weakness, the sin, and they had chosen each other. They had chosen to stand together against the world's cruelty. The storm raged, but inside they were still. When the storm passed, hours later, the wind shifted. It came down from the North Fork of the valley, clean and washed by the rain, and on it, faint, distant, almost a dream, she heard it, the sound of a girl's laughter. Anna, carefree, safe, and happy. It was a reminder of all that was lost, but it was also a reminder of the fragile, painful, and beautiful grace that remained. Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with other listeners. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.